Uh, Good morning, everyone. I'm back. I wanted to point out I've been a little bit ill. I'm not sure whether you can see this, but my right eye is in a lot of pain. There's nothing new about it. It's a result of allergies. I'm allergic to various kinds of pollen, and sometimes it really drops me down. So this has been one of those times. So I'm beginning to surface. Uh, I have a lot going on too, so it's a little bit hectic for me. I'm just being honest. We have a Zoom session tomorrow, and I'm happy about that because I just want to touch base and see that everything is okay with the group assignments. Those of you who have yet to join a group or have no intention of joining a group, I do have an alternate assignment, an alternative, I should say. Uh, so I have made that available to those of you who have let me know that you would prefer to do a an individual assignment, or you simply have no other choice. So I had said early on that I would create such an assignment, and I have. So that is available. I I also want to discuss tomorrow the third assignment, just so that you can get that started if you'd like. I don't think that will be a very complicated assignment, to be honest. What I want is some of your thinking on transformation, and that's what I want to talk about now. I have no notes, and I've had no time to prepare this little presentation on transformation. But there were a few things I wanted to say about it offhand, just to position it. We will be looking at transformational leadership, but none of that will make much sense to us unless we have some independent notion, preferably a robust notion of transformation itself. So I wanted to add a few, I hesitate to call them stray comments, but I'm not sure they're well ordered. Let me put it to you that way. So I have a set of comments that are not well ordered. Uh, Here's my first comment. I think we should see transformation as a form of change. Now, I've said that in, I think, numerous reflections. I might have said it last week as well. So, in the domain of change management, one tends to see different types of change acknowledged. You have, for example, incremental change. You change a light bulb. Well, that's a very transactional, mechanical kind of change. It requires little planning, little thinking. It requires some conscious thought, some deliberation, but very little as a rule. And you can be whistling Beethoven and screw in a light bulb, right? Doesn't require a great deal of concentration. Uh, Change should be seen as a spectrum where you start with trivial incremental changes of that kind to changes in process, where, for example, you have a procurement process and you're attempting to eliminate certain steps. So you're reforming the process or revising the process. A good deal of change fits that category. So that type of change is consistent with revision or reform. Uh, Now, transformation is at one end of the spectrum of change. It's at the extreme end, at the deep end. Now, why do I say the deep end? Well, one thing's very clear about transformation as a form of change. It requires conscious deliberation. It requires planning, strategy, vision. And that's why transformation drives us to leadership. Because in transformation, and I've said this many times, it's useful. I don't want to make an absolute distinction between management and leadership, but it's useful to make a practical distinction, right? So in transformation, you're taking a process, an idea, a system of some kind, and you're not reforming it. You're not revising it. You're not tinkering with it. You're changing the fundamental elements of the system. So that's a very deep change. What you end up with at the end of change is quite different from what you had at the outset of change. And that is a deliberate objective of transformation. So when we are transforming X, we're not tinkering with it. We're not incrementally adjusting various channels of it, the dials, so to speak. We're not doing that. We're replacing the entire system, right? We're founding new basic principles. Let me give you two quick examples of transformation in the sense that I'm trying to explicate. The first is from physics, and it will be familiar to all of you. We had, with Newton, absolute space, absolute time. In that conception of space and time, it doesn't matter how you're moving through space at all. You will measure the same time that I measure in a stationary position on Earth, right? So at any point in space or time, the measurement of space or time will be uniform. That's the Newtonian conception of absolute space and time. And it was operative and guided us for, 250, 300 years until the arrival of Einstein. We all know his name. What did he do? He looked at those Newtonian notions of space and time and completely redrew them, right? So that space and time fall out of Einstein as fundamentally different conceptions. So what happens in the Einsteinian world? I think you all know this. If we get on a spaceship and we travel, say, at 3/4 the speed of light, we're going to find that time slows down. That's what we will find. And that's an experimental result, not a theoretical one. We've tested relativity many, many, many times, and it's now core to our understanding of physical reality. That is a transformation in an idea or a conception. Now, let me give you another example of a transformation with respect to organizations. And it's a personal example from my own professional experience. I worked at a place, in fact, I grew up as a professional in a place called the National Research Council of Canada, a beloved institution of mine. I love it. I think the role of government science is underappreciated, but critical to the success of Canadian society in many different respects. Now, let me describe the change. When I came on board, before we launched the change, the Research Council was seen as, by its own employees and by its managers, as a university without students. And what that meant was Dr. So-and-so would go, male or female, would go to the Research Council to do research, and would form a team of researchers and would work on electron spin or the meningitis vaccine, right? So these individuals, the organization as a whole, saw itself as a center of research, experimentation, and scientific knowledge. Now, that was its self-understanding. And it's hard to describe that in detail, but take my word for it. In the culture of the Research Council at that time, it was quite clear that most employees and managers saw the organization as a research facility dedicated to experimentation and scientific knowledge. So what happened? Well, in about 2000 or so, the president, I'll leave his name out of this, the president of the Research Council decided that it should develop itself in closer union with Canadian industry so that its science would have a direct industrial application. Now, it's difficult to explain to you how fundamental that seemingly tiny change was and still is. What happens as the Research Council moves through that transformation, and you can measure it, and you can measure it in very simple indirect terms. I'll give you some examples. But first, to describe the change, the state, the desired state of change, the Research Council put into place a variety of measures to move the organization towards greater industrial applicability. Now, the astounding thing about this is the Research Council, the NRC Act, states that role for the National Research Council. It is supposed to support industrial development. It was conceived to support industrial development. And over the years, in particular in the 40s and the 50s, because of the war, the council shifted its mandate almost without seeing it, right? The mandate and mission of the council changed, and it evolved into this self-conception of a research facility, right? Dedicated to scientific knowledge, the production of scientific knowledge. So in many respects, the transformation that was launched in 2000 was a retrieval. It was a return to the original mission of the organization, but the organization no longer thought of itself in those terms. Now, I know all of this might sound very abstract to you, but take my word for it. This is what we dealt with, right? We had furious people who were furious about the suggestion of the change, the mere suggestion. I'm a scientist. I'm not here to create new types of toothpaste for Colgate. Who do you think I am? So we ran into all those sorts of criticisms. What you will not see discussed in the literature so far, I was very surprised in the resilience text. There's almost no discussion of resistance. If you're involved in transformational change, you will meet with resistance every day of your life, because people do not simply accept change. That's not who we are, right? We tend to be set in our ways. Even scientists, technicians, engineers, set in their ways. So we dealt with people who were very set in their ways and who are not willing to consider the desired state behind the transformation that we sought. Now, to be honest, the transformation wasn't altogether successful, but it has been successful. There's no doubt about that. This is how you measure it. You look at the number of contracts to industry between scientists and engineers in the Research Council and Canadian industry. 20, 25 years ago, there were very few instances of those sorts of contracts. Now, there are hundreds of them. Bibliometric data, before, you would have seen in 2000 or prior thereto, you would have seen all sorts of scientific publications. And NRC has contributed some astounding scientific knowledge, has produced astounding scientific knowledge. So it's not as though it was somehow incapable of doing that. It was quite capable of doing that. And in fact, as I recall, the key points of resistance were in the most successful scientific institutes. Why? Because there, the view of the scientist as a research scientist, as an experimenter, as a producer of scientific knowledge, there it was most entrenched of all. So that became very difficult because we were in effect telling the most successful parts of the organization, no, we now want to reorient your work over time. So there's this direct connection to industrial applications. I can tell you that did not go over well. Some people left, right? And you have to face those consequences. Not everyone will see the point in the desired state, right, in the transformation. But now, if you look at the Research Council, its effort was to drive innovation in Canada, to be a principal driver of innovation in Canada, where innovation is understood more or less as bringing scientific knowledge to industry so that industry can look at that knowledge and derive practical benefits from it. So, to give you an example, NRC has often worked with the likes of Hewlett Packard on, new engines that produce less harmful gases or what have you. Now, if you go to the Research Council and you read its reports, you'll find that the connection to industry has been established. And that is a transformation. Why? Because you're going to start hiring different kinds of people. You're going to start having different types of process. You're going to require different types of leadership. Just focus on the leadership for a moment. In an institution dedicated to innovation, you need leadership that can open doors, that can explain ideas, that can build relationships to industry. And that means stepping into a separate world, the world of business, and having some understanding of its needs, its requirements, its desires, its interests, right? So your leader can no longer afford to sit in a lab and lead scientific efforts within the lab. The leader has to get out of the lab. The leader has to confront industry and explain to industry how the science of the Research Council can be applied to innovation. So NRC now sees itself as the federal flagship of innovation in Canada. That's a transformation. It took about 20 years to accomplish. I don't think it's complete, the transformation, but there's no doubt, in my mind anyhow, that the institution has changed and that it's changed in such a way as to be described as transformed. So the change is fundamental to the types of people you hire, the types of processes you establish to manage operations, the relationships to industry. It has changed the organization in the very sense that it has transformed the organization. So transformation, these are both examples of where what you start with is fundamentally different from what you end up with. So transformation, in my view, should not be seen as reform. Reform, and this relates to resilience, I think I've made this point several times, but reform doesn't seek to replace the fundamental elements of a system or a process with new elements. Reform doesn't intend to change the thing, right? The thing comes out of the wash in reform as the same thing that it was when it went into the wash. It's changed. To follow the washing metaphor, I have this yellow shirt on. If I put it on, if I put it in the wash with a red shirt that's never been washed before, this shirt's not going to be yellow when it comes out of the wash. That's a transformation. Still a shirt, but it's a very different color. So that's not a very good parallel. My point is, in the case of the Research Council or absolute space and time, what you have at the end of the transformation is fundamentally different from what you had at the outset. That's the point. So I would have us consider, I would have us considering transformation as at that end of the change spectrum. So when you're going into transformation, there is a fundamental door that is opened to leadership. Now, why? Why is leadership important in transformation? Again, I'm repeating myself here, but you can manage incremental change. It can be managed. You cannot manage transformation. It's not possible. You can plan it. You can write strategies for it. You can articulate a vision for it, but you cannot manage it. Why? Because of its nature. As you transform a system, and I'll just focus on systems for now, as you transform a system, because you're removing fundamental elements from the system before you've established new elements, that creates a world in tension, a world that shifts right under your feet, a world in which you cannot nail things down, right? Because many of your fundamental management strategies and processes are being removed. And again, before you have a complete replacement for any of them, there's always a period in transformation in which you're suspended between the past and the future, between a world in which you had certain processes, or at least established and well understood processes, and a world in which you have no processes, right? You have no established processes. You're attempting to establish them. And that takes a good deal of time and a good deal of work. It is very rare that in transformation, that when you attempt to replace a fundamental element of a system, people inside the system say, oh, yeah, sure, I'm all for it. Go ahead. I've been doing it this way for 25 years, but hey, you want to change it? And, you know, at my advanced stage, require me to learn a new system at a fundamental level, fundamentally new system? Screw you. That's not an uncommon, that's not an uncommon response. So, and those responses, I might say, I have seen many, many times. So I've been at the receiving end of them. It's never pleasant, but you need to understand what transformation means, right? So we live in a world in which I think, if I'm not mistaken, we need to transform an awful lot of things. For example, the literature I put into the course on economics is all about that. The carrying economy is a fundamental transformation of the capitalist economy, right? So if you articulate that view, do not expect the chief executive of some oil company or mining company to say, oh, I'm 100% behind that. Yeah, let's have a carrying economy in which profit is no longer the fundamental driver of the economy. What's the driver of the economy? Human well-being, right? That would be a transformation. And every CEO in this country would resist it. That would be my guess, with perhaps the exception of CEOs in health, although I'm out on a limb there. I doubt they would either. So you can see, or you should be able to see, if you think about it for a few minutes, the transformation of our economy, for example, would require years. And it means having the leadership required to bring people on board, to take resistance and transform it into acceptance, right? That is not an easy thing to do, but that's the task of transformation. And I just want to be clear about that, because we sometimes, I've seen it in some of the texts that we've read, sometimes our authors don't seem to appreciate the distinction between reform and transformation. Reform requires a certain amount of leadership, perhaps, but a good deal of reform can be managed, meaning we have the processes we need. They are already established, say governance, for example, which is a management process for reforming something, say, even if we're reforming governance. Do we know what we're doing? Yes, we know what we're doing. We have conceptions of governance, principles of governance, models of governance, and we can make direct reference to them. Models of transformation, by contrast, are very rare. And if you find one, it's not at all clear that it's going to provide you with a good deal of guidance, because transformation is something that has to be lived. It has to be experienced. So, and as I said, the idea of having a control panel that you can modify and adjust in order to drive transformation is a practical absurdity. So yes, there are practical steps we can take to advance transformation, but they do not amount to a management control board. There is no such control board. So here we are in the thick of leadership, in transformation, where we have almost no option to manage change. We have to lead it. And it's the only way through it, right? So who is the leader in transformation? The leader in transformation is the individual who's willing to step out on a limb, who's willing to face uncertainties, who's willing to face a shifting reality, a ground that is shifting. So the fundamental elements of the system are shifting. So you cannot rely on standard management practices. You have to use something called judgment, often reflective judgment. Now, there's a whole literature on that, and I'm writing a book review on one of them. And I don't want to go into that. But I do think the world of transformation is a world in which management has a small role as compared with leadership. Because what drives transformation at the end of the day is a clear vision of the desired state and the road thereto. And it's never one simple path, right? And in fact, you seldom have a clear idea of the path anyway, because what you find in transformation is, as you're heading down path A, you suddenly find yourself deviating at, say, right angles on path B. When you're on path B, oh my God, you run into obstacles X and Y, and suddenly you're going in a new direction, C, right? So my point is, the road to the desired state and transformation is never monotonic. It's never simply an ascending, line. We start here and we end up there. It's always it's always sinusoidal. In the sense that it's always up and down, right? So in transformation, you never see a direct path. There is no direct path. So in management, you can, of course, do path analysis and try to, optimize paths and do some fancy mathematics and figure out how you get from A to B. most efficiently. That option doesn't exist in transformation. So I don't want to drone on. I don't know how long I've been speaking, but this is all extemporaneous on my part, which means I'm just speaking off the top of my head. Now, I've been thinking about these topics for years, so it's not quite off the top of my head. But for today, in most cases, I scribble down a few notes to guide my own presentation. And today I decided to wing it because I wanted to say a few things about transformation, just to position it in with respect to leadership in particular. One more point I would mention is the principles for building resilience. That text, it says very little about leadership. And I think it says very little about leadership because in that world, in the world of resilience, as described in that text, you can manage ecosystems, right? You can manage their resilience. The doctrine of resilience is, for the most part, a management doctrine. So in the world of resilience, right, you can manage. And that's very unlike the world of transformation, in which it's very difficult to manage, right? It's not as though you can simply apply principles of transformation and start managing a transformation. Whereas in principles for building resilience, that is what is done, right? They articulate some principles and they say, look, you need to apply these to successfully manage ecosystems, you know. So I would conclude with that thought. Transformation, we have no clear model of it ourselves. So what we will try to do in the next couple of weeks is come to an understanding of what transformation is and how it bears on the issue of leadership, right? So that takes us, in my opinion, to the cutting edge of organizational thinking, to be honest, because there's no doubt that, among other things, we need to transform our organizations and, to a degree, our communities, if you see our communities as organizations, right? So what I'm trying to say to you is the management that we've built in the last 200 years, the processes that we use in management, are not suited to transformation. So we need to give serious thought to how we will lead transformations. I think it is clear to all of us that transformation is required. Again, I'll close with this thought. You look at those social development goals of the UN. Forget about the fact that they're supposed to be achieved by 2030. Just forget about that. Let's just act as if time were infinite. It's very clear we can't manage our way to those goals, right? End poverty. How do we end poverty in a system like ours? Because a system like ours engineers poverty. It's a direct consequence of it. So if we're serious about ending poverty or ending hunger, to take another quite ambitious objective, transformation has to become a way of life. And again, we cannot go to our management textbooks, open them up, and expect to find useful guidance there. So this takes us to a serious challenge, which can be expressed in this question. Given that transformation requires leadership, which type of leadership does it require? Right? That, I think, is the key question. for us. Now, you can see that given that we need to transform a range of variables, right? I gave the example of our economy, but there are countless other examples. Uh, we'll need to do a lot of thinking about that as a society, as a species. And I'm not sure we're up to the task, but we can give it a good try. And that's what I'd like to focus on. So this is enough. Thanks for listening. I'll post this. I think it's okay. It's a bit sloppy, but anyhow, thank you.